All right. So again, welcome. My name is John Beebe, and I lead the Democratic Engagement Exchange here at Toronto Metropolitan University. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land that I have the privilege to call home is sacred land. This land is the territory of the Haudenosaunee nations, such as the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, and the Seneca, as well as the Anishinaabe, most recently visited by the Mississaugas of New Credit. And the territory later became the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe to peacefully share and care for the resources and relationships around the Great Lakes. And as we discuss living in a pluralistic community today, I am reminded that this is not a new issue and that we can learn from the wisdom of the generations that have come before us, and we can learn from their experiences today. So today, if you are joining us from before and have old friends, I think I see some of our old friends here. Welcome. To those of you joining us for the first time, it's great to have you here. Our mission at the Exchange is simple. It is to build a vibrant and inclusive democracy. But this simple mission is not easy, and we cannot do it without all of our partners and allies and communities across Canada. To borrow a phrase from Hari Han, we seek to build a culture of democratic engagement that makes voting not just possible, but probable and powerful. I am very grateful that Vandinika Shukla from the Obama Foundation is able to share her experiencing fostering pluralism at a moment when, for many, that feels like a lost dream. Her work reminds us what is possible. I immigrated to Canada with my family in 2008 because I wanted to live in a country where leaders from all political parties talked about diversity as a strength and pluralism as a lived experience. So before turning it over, I want to share one story that I will never forget and that captures this experience. I was leading a training for volunteers at North York Community House here in Toronto. We were sitting in a windowless meeting room with mismatched chairs. And as an icebreaker, I asked everyone to share who they would choose as a leader of Canada if they could choose anyone in the world throughout history. All the volunteers were born in different countries, and we heard wonderful answers from Gandhi to my mother. But the last person to share was a quiet, older gentleman from China. He said that he grew up in a country with strong leaders and that had not worked out so well. So he was not going to choose a leader. He was going to choose a system, and he would choose democracy. It was a powerful reminder of the wisdom that is available in all of our communities when we remember to listen. And with that, I will turn it over to Victoria Kuketz, our amazing host and true champion for Canada's democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. And what an absolute pleasure it is to be able to be with all of you. And I see some of our very long-term friends and community builders who've joined us online today. So a special hello to all of you. And also welcome to a very special edition of the Democracy Dialogues. I really appreciate us coming together in this moment on this hot summer day to actually choose to be together inside and online at our computers so we can focus on our shared work and, let's be honest, our heavy priorities as well. And I'm very proud to be able to introduce my new friend and new collaborator as well in our democracy work, Vandinika Shukla. We met over coffee at an AI conference and really poured our hearts out to one another. And we talked about, how do we respond to this current moment? We talked about the responsibilities we commit to in our communities each day. And what I really appreciated as well was we really committed to thinking out loud, testing theories, thoughts, and potential practices of how we could do this work in a way that felt more responsive and easier said than done, quite frankly, faster too. So I'd really like to tell you a little bit about her and then welcome this extraordinary person into conversation. So Vandinika is the Deputy Director of Global Programs at the Obama Foundation, where she works with changemakers in the US on building common ground trust in institutions, and pluralism to strengthen democratic culture. But her work, which spans the intersection of human rights, diplomacy, tech policy, and democracy, has a much longer history, which includes studying and teaching at Harvard and the London School of Economics, the UN, and with the Democracy Forward team at Microsoft, where she worked on AI and securing democratic processes on global elections. And yes, we found out that we even had a common friend in Dave Leichman, where many of you would have met him at the most recent Canadian Vote Summit, both this year and last year. So with that, welcome Vandinika. And I know I speak on behalf of all of us when I say just how happy and grateful we are to have you join us.
Thanks, Victoria, and thank you, John, for the generous introduction, and more importantly, welcome into this vibrant community that I have been, witnessing and watching grow, and what a delight to be in conversation with you today.
Excellent. So I feel like let's dig right in. And, I'd like to start out with some common terminology because, for a lot of people, and even for me, pluralism can be a lofty political science term that can feel abstract and unknowable. But what does it really mean for you and when it's broken down in practice?
Yeah, that's a really good place to start, right? I think, and that's something that we're witnessing with a lot of different ideas and practices, whether that's democracy or climate action. There are these big, lofty ideas, but they become so esoteric and in our head, but what does that mean in practice and experience? In simple words, pluralism is just how to be in conversation and collaboration with those that don't look like us, don't think like us, don't live like us. And I want to make a distinction between pluralism is more than just tolerance. It's a commitment to living and working productively together in diverse societies. So I don't just tolerate your differences and just to coexist and erase them, but I engage with them. And the way that, personally, how that has shown up for me is growing up in a family with everyone having the freedom to choose their choice of faith and practice that. For me to leave my country and move to the United States, and find coexistence, but also an opportunity to engage in the democratic fabric of this country through the work that I do. And so those are the ways that it has shown up. And I think this is why it matters right now. Today's challenges are by default complex, they're interdependent, and they're rooted in systems that cross borders, sectors, and communities. And so, in a way, diversity of those lived experiences and the identities that we have are actually foundational to make our systems work better, because they will then bring us more trust, legitimacy, adaptability, and that will then translate to sustainability of the change we seek. And the diversity will most definitely lead to tension and difference. And I think a lot of the times we kind of shy away from tension and feel, our bodies react to that, right? Physically as well, because we see difference as a disruptor, but actually it can be a catalyst to imagine a new future. And that's where pluralism really comes in as a real tool to drive change. And as President Obama has often said, building bridges is not contrary to equality and social justice. It is, in fact, the best tool for delivering lasting change.
That's so helpful. And thank you for helping us ground the conversation with so many different examples and also starting to storytell about your own life and reason for doing this work as well. I think one word that really resonates with me is when you said coexistence, because I feel like if we were to put it into a nutshell, I might start to use some keywords and that would definitely be at the center of it. And so I guess one question I want to ask you as a follow-up is, if we're going to coexist in society in a way that, has that tension that you talked about, but ultimately still has us as neighbors and community members, how can we hold strong to our convictions and deeply held beliefs, but also meaningfully engage each other and other people who might seem like adversaries, or as your boss says, how do we disagree with one another without hating each other?
Yeah, and that's really the current moment that we're living in, that has sort of accentuated by varying forces, the least of them technological forces that have gotten us to this point. And when I think of that tension of how do I make sure I stay true to my values, true to my identity, and yet make space for another different identity and value and engage with it, right? So the distinction between coexisting but actually engaging with difference are two different practices and two different habits. And the way that I have been thinking about is like learning from the incredible work that John Powell is doing at the Othering and Belonging Institute, where they make a distinction between inclusion and belonging. And they make that distinction in terms of its relationship to structural change. So they say inclusion is when, I have created the table and I'm inviting you and giving you a seat at the table. So I've constructed this table where I've made the rules and set the dinner table, right? And there's a power dynamic there. And they contrast that with belonging, which inherently means that we're creating a sense of agency. Can we make you a part of co-creation by recognizing that difference is real? I'm not blurring out the difference, but actually I'm making you part of the design process. So I'm actually shifting the power dynamic here by creating a sense of belonging that everyone feels. And then how I interpret it is that once you have belonging, you have solidarity and you have power. And that's when you kind of move the needle on anything that you want to, advance.
That is so helpful in terms of how you describe it. I guess one question I have for you, because I was trying to think in my head and work through, what kind of skills are required when it comes to really building those tables of co-creation. Like obviously negotiation is one that comes to mind. I'm wondering what other ones that get called up for you as you think through this work.
Yeah, negotiation is certainly an important one there, right? You're kind of thinking about not just our shared values, but also interests, and being very realistic and pragmatic about what is it that we share in common, and where will we draw a red line, and what is our negotiation where it's reservation point to meeting and making this coalition work. Another big tool that I have used in a lot of communities and a lot of movements and campaigns, but also with at the foundation and in my teaching work, is storytelling. Storytelling to find shared values in the room, even across differences. And how that can work is that oftentimes, we come to a room and we kind of do this sort of categorical way of defining each other and put ourselves in labels and boxes. And even in our huddle before, I was like, I am a Celsius person, I'm not doing Fahrenheit, and I am never
That was so funny.
math of it. Or you come into a room and say, oh, you're all politically elected officials, or you're all business people, or you're all tech bros, or whatever. And these are all categorical ways to put us in boxes. But when you start working through storytelling and you ask the question of, like, what are the lived experiences that you've had and I've had, you start to get into this idea of an experiential sense of belonging and usness in the room. And that's when your values become real. It's one thing for me to come into a room and tell you we all share the values of equality or justice and use all these big words, but then it's another thing to really talk about, when have we practiced that value? When have we showed up for it? And when have we made choices that tell you that it is true that we've actually acted on those values? And that's where, from the action comes this deduction that we share these values. And I think so storytelling is a really, really important tool. And in my work on the Boston Mayoral campaign and vaccine hesitancy in the US with the MIT Media Lab, we really worked with local trusted influencers when we wanted to have these community roundtables across differences. So we, and by local trusted influencers, I mean your preachers, your barbers, your teachers, sports coaches, family members, who have long-standing trusted relationships with the people that they are in community with. And there you can actually have a much more trusted messenger, and it's not just a one and done, but it's also grounded in your lived experience, and it's not sort of a top-down imposition of this idea of pluralism.
So what I really appreciate about what you're doing right now is like pulling the curtain back a bit on community building with value and with care, right? Because I think a lot of people come to these conversations wanting to do no harm, right? But actually going into communities and making sure we're doing it with trust and with care and without being extractive is a completely different thing. And so I really appreciated that you talked about connecting in with local influencers, as you put it, who you can start to build that relationship with and can essentially do that vouch for in community, right? So I think that's a very helpful story to tell. And I want to double click on the storytelling piece and ask you if you can start to tell us a little bit about your current work with the Obama Foundation and how you really start to translate pluralism into those actionable leadership practices, especially with grassroots and emerging leaders. And I'd love to hear examples of some people that you've been working with and some kind of the initiatives that you're working on as well, and really what sticks with you.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And at the Obama Foundation, I wear the hat of the Leaders USA program lead and run a program for changemakers in the US across sectors, issues, ideologies, where they come to us for a real network that is convened to build values-based leadership to strengthen democratic culture, collective action, and forces of pluralism in our communities, both locally and globally. And these are changemakers 24 to 45 years old, right? And the unique piece about President and Mrs. Obama was that when they left the White House, before a building, they actually invested in people. And the first thing they did was invest in the next generation of changemakers. So the first thing that we do really is convene an ideologically diverse room. That's where it all begins. We need to convene folks from the public sector, private sector, civil society. We need someone at JP Morgan, we need a community organizer, we need a faith-based leader, we need a climate action activist, we need like a mayor, we need all of them in the room for the long arc so that they can build those strong relationships and then they can call each other to build coalitions and power when the time comes, or any other sort of road trip that I know many of our leaders are organizing after the program. Some of the ways that we work with them in terms of skill building is we start with storytelling. We ask them, what are the values that call you to leadership? And what is the story behind that? Who are you? Why are you called to this work? Then we go into storytelling of like, what is this room about? Who are we? Where is the hope in this room? And how do you situate that? And then what are the urgent challenges that we want to work on? And then we kind of move into work around how do we build power? How do we change our relationship to power? How do we connect across differences? How do we think about practicing pluralism? Pluralism is a muscle. We're not born with it. We have to practice it. We'll go 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, and then we'll have to learn over and over again. And we sort of move into then systems level change as well. And thinking about how do we then go from me, all of us as a community, to the systems I'm part of, in the change that I want to make. Speaking of the people we convene and the great fortune that we have of the types of people that we're convening, I'm going to maybe lift up one example from the Leaders USA program, but then maybe another example from my own life in this work to really elicit a specific point around their work on relationship building and how this is a long piece of work.
Very long.
Very, very long piece of work, right? And so in terms of bridging, you were talking about bridging and that requiring a lot of trust building as well. And that sustains the connection over time. And so, for example, we have Jared Morey, who is a pastor, and he is the director of strategic relationships at the Minnesota Council of Churches. And at the council, he leads a project called the Respectful Conversations Project, which is a peace-building initiative that aims to boost empathy, improve social cohesion, and strengthen democracy through structured, facilitated conversations among diverse beliefs. And he is among one of many of our faith-based leaders who has dedicated his role as a clergy person to build bridges across diverse communities on controversial issues, especially across, different diverging viewpoints to further the role of religious pluralism in strengthening democracy. And then another example that I could maybe bring at another time in our conversation right today is just other international examples of how folks are building those communities and coalitions to activate them when the time comes. So yeah, I hope that answers your question around some of the ways that we work with our leaders, who's in the room, how we shape that table matters a lot, and then how we help them see each other's power then takes us to the next level.
Absolutely. And I think the interfaith, coalition building is a really interesting one, especially in such a, rich and multicultural place like Canada. And, I'm doing this conversation from Toronto. So that really strikes a chord with me in terms of being able to convene community and put them in conversation in places where you might think there might be different belief systems as a starting point to how we can scale that. But before I ask you the next question, I actually want to turn to our audience a little bit because Vandinika asked a really interesting question that I'd love for all of you to add into as well. I'm wondering what kind of values call you to leadership. So if you want to use the chat and feel free to introduce yourself, where you're signing in from, and just feel free to use some keywords. We'd love to hear, what really keeps you going and what you build your work around. And with that, I actually wanted to share one that really resonated with me as I was reading through the breadth of the work of the foundation as well. And I was really moved by hearing Berto Aguayo speak, who runs Increase the Peace. And I want to tell our audience a little bit about him. And you probably know his work better than me, so feel free to jump in too. But this really, it really resonated with me because this person's life, it seemed, could have gone in two very different directions. And the one he chose, I think, really instills that hope in a difficult moment. So as I understand, Berto is an attorney and a founder of Increase the Peace, which is a violence prevention not-for-profit in the south side of Chicago. And when I heard him speak and it was on YouTube online, he talked about how he joined a gang at 13 years old. But, community members mentored him. I believe he said a local police officer mentored him, that a principal helped him find employment, and that he got a job in an alderman's office where he discovered his purpose of really building community and making Chicago a better place. And so he ultimately left the gang at 17, which I think we all know is much easier said than done, and instead founded Increase the Peace and opened an office on the same block that he grew up. And I just thought that was such a stunning and extraordinary story, but also really the lineage of someone who could have made very different choices, but chose to be a force for good and for positivity. I'm wondering if there's, any other ones that come to mind for you that have really personally touched you.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that story. And I think it just goes to, again, elicit, speak to kind of the power of those local trusted influencers in
Yes.
your immediate community, who you have long-standing relationships with. Another person that I've been thinking a lot of lately, and this may be going into a little bit of a tangent from where you were, but I'm holding on to that thread of like, how do you build trust over a long period of time?
Yes.
As a way to bridge differences, or as a consequence of bridging differences, right? Because bridging divides doesn't mean erasing differences. It means building relationships. And we can't exist in isolation as humans, but as particularly in leadership and knowing the audience in the room who is working to activate a lot of communities and systems, that doesn't happen alone. And so one of the most important strategies to bridging divides that I have come to learn and teach has been to build relationships with quality, depth, and shared experiences. So you simply need to break bread together and get a meal. Similar to like our coffee, where we were talking about our parents who raised us and the experience of crossing cultures long before we got to any of the work that we want to do together, because relationships is how we construct ourselves and our communities and our organizations. And why I share this preamble is because one of the leaders that I got to meet, called Sarah Durio, who is a community organizer in France, really gives, is an incredible example of how long-term relationships actually can lead to urgent action. So if you remember, there was a civil society response to the snap elections in France in July 2024 and how
Yes.
left collaborated to win, right? But the work didn't start in July 2024. It was 2 years ago across different forms of organizations. And they had formed a lot of personal bonds of trust through different campaigns and movements that they had done over over and over again over a long period of time, so that when the announcement came, Sarah shares that we set up the WhatsApp, like we messaged the WhatsApp group, like, that had been set to discuss European campaigns. In that moment, within 30 minutes of Macron's announcement to call new elections, they said, we've got to talk. And they were on a Zoom call in 30 minutes. And they went from a group of 20 people to 50 from various organizations that evening. And then eventually that WhatsApp group became 130 members organized around a dozen thematic exchange groups. And that 130 is not just those 130 people. They're 130 with their own networks and nodes, and own sort of in trusted relationships that they're going to activate and mobilize to collective action. And what I remember from when she shared her story was, they had a popular slogan over the last few weeks, which was "On s'engueulera après," which is like, we'll argue later, right? Beyond rivalries and disagreements, the bonds forged over the years were so strong for them to mobilize a force that proved essential for the success of the New Popular Front and to defeat the far right in France. And so I share that example to lift up the importance of those interpersonal links and the solidarity and shared trust that you have to really patiently build. And then you can one day activate them in less than an hour,
That's really incredible to hear. And what I really love about that too is we often talk about the perils of social media and kind of the lack of safety in online spaces, but I love how you're talking about a positive example, an enduring example of community building that actually achieved quite a bit of impact. And so I think as we continue to condense these lessons and think about takeaways from today, what are we doing individually to build these positive communities and these movements online, so that we can counterbalance some of the more negative things that are happening too. And I also wanted to share what our amazing guests have been sharing in the chat. So I want to say hi to Roya, who's calling in from Washington, D.C. So she shared the values that guide her are imagination and hope. I think imagination is one that we really need to talk about more, right? Because we can be so mired in the everyday, but creative capacity and collaboration, like the coffee that I had with you, which made me feel so creatively inspired, is something that I think can fill our cup. And I want to talk about burnout later, but I have a few follow-up questions for you first. And then we also have Ronnie Cruz from Montreal. Hi, Ronnie. Who said, what calls me to leadership is actively working towards equity and supporting and accompanying unheard voices, building safe spaces through care. I love that concept of accompanying unheard voices. And I think that's how we build trust too, right? It's like, as we build our communities and our platforms, who can we elevate to help with their work and really share that and grow that space as well, right? There's a generosity to this work too. But I have kind of like a tough question for you. And it's one that I know we're all thinking through ourselves, because at the exchange and with some of our sister organizations across the country, we've really been working on polarization for the past few years, which, has shifted quite a bit. And, our nations are working through it as well. But I love that we're engaging in a positive expression of pluralism today. But I am wondering, how have you seen examples historically? How have you contended with those who may not have accepted that outstretched hand when it came to co-creation or sitting at that table together, and actually may see opportunity in kind of steamrolling efforts towards pluralism? Do you see it as reticence initially, or tell me some of your thoughts around this?
Yeah, that's an alive question, and it actually takes me back to the start of my career in human rights compliance at the United Nations, where we were negotiating every day between member states for compliance around conventions and discrimination against women, for example. And a lot of the times, the first response is no, is a closed door.
Right.
And so I think it always brings me back to what we had just about started talking about, is negotiations. This is still very much negotiation. We are in a leadership practice in that moment. And so oftentimes it is also, even in personal lives, you're always negotiating and holding two ideas that are very contrary to each other, or two, perspectives very opposite to each other at the same time. And so you have to always be practicing like two things can be true. And we live in this gray zone, and we get more and more comfortable in the gray zone. But to your question around how do you engage with that reticence at first, I think firstly it is knowing what is our, as I said, like what is our reservation point, what is our red line, what is something that we will not compromise on, and a lot of times it will be those values. What will we not compromise on? How far are we willing to go? But also, what are some trade-offs that we can make, and what does incremental progress look like? We may not get to 100% today, but if we make 20% progress, that is still forward movement. And that is still building a relationship for us to then come back to at another negotiation or another table where we want someone to open the door and not have that reticence. And they likely may not have that because they've already been in partnership with us and we have sort of given and taken something with them. And so much like in a negotiation where you kind of lay out all of your options and you sequence all of those options and you say, what can I trade off today for later to have some leverage or some relationship or some trust to then come back to the table. But I think even before that, a few steps before that is really, how do you think about not just shared values, but shared interests? And that's where you get a little bit more strategic and tactical about how you want to advance a certain type of change or goal that you're advancing. And when you think about your interests, when you think about what are the coalitions I need to build to have the type of power and influence that can actually shape the room or that can open the door that has been closed to me. And so I think along with thinking of it as negotiations, another way to think about it is also think about power. What is the power that we're building much long before we came to the room or to the table? And oftentimes you will see that it's not just power within us as the opposition, because the opposition is like, we're not all monoliths. So like if I am the opposition, or I am not all representing just one idea or one person, I'm representing a big constellation. And there could be fragmentation there could be me practicing pluralism even within my own people. So it's not just like, oh, you're the other side, so I need to practice my pluralism muscle with you, but actually within my own side, I have to do that. And so one big piece of work that we have to do is think about how are we building power with our people, with those that are on the other side of the aisle, long before we come into the room. And then, that power is built over time through relationships, through kind of starting with stories, starting with breaking bread, and then coming to like, okay, what are the trade-offs that we can make today? Because we know we're going to be in relationship for a very long time. So it's not just one deal that I'm doing with you, but actually I'm in relationship with you for many, many years. So it's not just a one and done transaction, but actually it's a relationship.
I think that's really interesting. And it calls up two memories for me. So number one, a more international one is I remember I went to see a talk at a law school years ago where there was like an international negotiator who went into war zones to talk to different people and to try to find common ground. And she actually let me know, to your point, that she used storytelling and she actually used local narratives. She would go in and she would read the stories, the histories, the cultural touch points of both sides of this conflict, and then be able to bring those to the table and actually instrumentalize the learnings and share the narratives with each of them to try and find common ground. So it's an interesting thing. And, like, not to make light of it in any way, but if it can work in war zones, then I think it can work in these different and difficult and sometimes seemingly intractable communities as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to the work that we did around the Boston mayoral campaign, where we sort of went around for all neighborhoods of Boston, and we said, let's have community conversations, and let's use those conversations as sort of an antidote to polling data, and take that to the mayors who were to the mayoral debates, take that to local journalists, and create a sort of citizen public bank of stories for them to see each other more than just issues. So when we went to a table, we didn't sort of start with like, what do you think about education reform or affordable housing? We sort of we asked them, how do you experience education in your family? What does it mean for your kid to go to school and afford the kind of quality education that the kid deserves and needs? And that's where we start, where then what happened was we not only in the moment kind of created a culture for them to build relationships with each other, look across issues, but and labels, as we were talking about, right? Look across the labels that I put on each other and talk about those experiences, stories. But then it created the foundation for when we finished our program, they then went on to build and coalitions together, and as simple as like apply for grants together, and create new programs for their communities, and also be a real source of true information for their elected representative, because that information was not aggregated polling data, it was a lived experience, but scaled, right? And that could always be a tension of how do we scale this work, and that's kind of the work that is ahead of us, of this work that is so intimate, one-on-one, and long-term. How do we take it bigger, broader, and over the long arc of change?
Well, I think you just officially issued your first call to action for our audience, right? So I think that's an amazing thing for us all to go out and do, to be part of making community banks of stories. And I also think in that was a very interesting way to position, because we also know that this system is very resource scarce, and oftentimes we are competing for funding. But I genuinely think, and I know from the work that I've done nationally here too, that if we were to put forward really genuine and authentic initiatives that bridge those divides, that would be something that might attract those very scarce funding dollars, and really show how we build more secure, more resilient, and pluralistic societies, because this is much easier said than done. I guess one story I want to share, and then I have a follow-up question for you, is, when we met for coffee, I shared that, I am an Indian woman with an Eastern European last name, and I think that's very evocative of my own family's history. And, I have this incredible matriarch in my grandmother who's 98 years old. And each one of my mom and her siblings married someone of a different background and a different faith. So our dinner table was absolutely about negotiation, about necessary conflict around different ideas and different values, and different ways of practicing faith. But we had this incredibly strong matriarch who said, we're going to eat dinner together, and we can negotiate how we give gratitude. We're going to sit here and we're going to eat that dinner. And it was always delicious, by the way. But there was this incredible force of nature who really said, we're going to be a family and we're going to be a community. And so that made, coming to the commitment of our family's community faster. And that's the word that I want to ask you about. We talked about trust taking time. We talked about bridging divides taking time, but we're in a moment where we don't have time. So I am just wondering, have you seen any examples, or have you been able to meditate on any ways that we can do this work faster, but still live in community and live on observing our ideals?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story of yours that I have the fortune of being intimately familiar with, but also share the power of those grandmothers.
Yes.
Right.
Big grandmother energy, right?
Big grandmother energy. And you pair that with food and a dining table, and you've kind of started solving a lot of the problems that we think of in our head, right? I think a lot of the problems that we are looking at, scrolling on our phones, is are actually heart problems at first. And this is where the work happens, in our homes, in our kitchen tables, in our dining rooms with our grandfathers and grandfathers. And so I share that legacy of having two very powerful, kind, loving women who have raised me to practice that. But you raise an important, tough question around, we don't have time, and how do we do this? And the way that I've been meditating on this has been, I see myself, through the work that I've done so far, I see myself as sort of a bridge builder between institutions and grassroots movements, and have had the opportunity to sit in both rooms, but also have those rooms talk to each other. And an institution is doing that long arc of change. The grassroots movement is saying, we need to build power now. There is this fierce urgency of now that we need to kind of make change happen. And I often think about, firstly, this idea of shrinking the change, which has been talked about by many folks, and Chip and Dan Heath in their work, and Samantha Power has then propagated that idea as well, of how do we start small, and identify that starting small doesn't necessarily mean we've given up, or we're not doing enough, or that it isn't meaningful. Because starting small is not saying take the easy, low-hanging fruit. Starting small still is strategic, and we need to think about what are the tactics that will line up to a strategy for us to deliver the change we want. And so I think one of the ways that I've been mediating on the sort of urgency and long arc or long-term change making piece has been to think about how do we break it down when we think about climate change and climate action.
Which feels so overwhelming.
So overwhelming, right? When I ask you, sort of, even as a leader, if I were to get on a platform and say, I'm going to, help me, like, let's solve climate change, it's not going to motivate anyone, right? And then motivation comes from, obviously, the hard work, which is where the storytelling plays a role, the relationship building. But the motivation also comes from knowing that we can make a difference and knowing that there's a pathway to change or pathway to action. And so you're saying that, like, here's the one task that we can all do together, and that will add up and level up to effectively, eventually getting to battling this very, very overwhelming big piece of work. So I often think about that idea of shrinking the change before we tackle the big dragons and slay them.
I love that piece. And I actually would love to call on the audience too to write to us after the dialogue and talk about the way that you're facing the necessity of now versus living in your ideals and values, but advancing. And the other thing is, I just want to say thank you to the person who started to put in questions for Vandinika already. We're going to get to questions in about 4 or 5 minutes. So this is your call to the whole audience to start sending them in. So you have this moment with her to really ask her the things that are on your mind and what brought you here today. But first, I want to follow up that question with a tough one that I think we all experience, is that this work and the work of pluralism often requires a kind of emotional labor that can lead to burnout, especially when you're engaging across painful and unequal lines of difference. A lot of people carry these lineages, these traumas. And so I'm just wondering if you can share your thoughts and meditations on how you've dealt with engaging in that emotional labor, if you're up to it, talking about how that plays out for you and how you eventually return back to a place of readiness and maybe even joy.
Yeah. Important question. Speaking of that sustainability of the work, and maybe I'll start with myself, and then I'll start with the kind of meditations that I've had when leading teams or leading campaigns and movements. A lot of the times the work that we do feels lonely, and it's important to recognize that it can be lonely to do this work, to kind of wake up every day and be that sort of champion of hope and the champion of, like, we will make a difference, and we'll move 1 step forward, 5 back. And in those moments, you actually need your own sources of resilience and hope. And that can come, for me, that comes from my family, that comes from my life as a performing artist, and seeing art and creativity as a real source of imaginations, speaking to that very important value of imagining a different future or making sense of our current moment as well.
What kind of art do you do? Can I ask?
Yes,
Yeah.
I grew up as an Indian classical dancer, and so
Oh, amazing.
I trained in Odissi, which comes from sort of the eastern part of India. And there was a lot of discipline in that craft, but a lot of orientation to see the world as so much more than what we see physically, right? And so having something intangible in our lives to draw inspiration from actually makes such a big difference in kind of filling up our reservoirs. And so that has been my story of for me, it is that dining table with my grandmother and my mother. For me, it is the chai that my mom makes every night.
Best.
Even though
Homemade chai.
no one understands why we drink caffeinated tea at 10 p.m., but it is a thing. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, it just fuels us up.
It's
And
like our comfort foods, right?
it's a comfort food, and we still get the full, like, you know, REM sleep and everything. It works.
Mm-hmm. Mine is like close connected. It's rice and dal, you know.
I know. Yeah.
Actually, to our audience, can you put like what are your comfort foods or ways that you're filling your cup while Vandinika finishes her answer?
Yeah, and so, you know, I think we need to find the ways that we fill our cup, and for me, it's the family, it's the arts, it's my girlfriends who are all very badass, but also very excuse the recording, but very grounded in who they are and who they're becoming. When I think about teams and movements, I really go back to what Cornel West has called he has talked about as there is joy in the struggle. And
Mm-hmm.
what that does, I think, is it takes a very different approach to resilience. And resilience then says it's about recognizing and celebrating the work it took to move from point A to B, right? As an organizer, we have when we design a campaign, we think of peaks and troughs, right? When are we going to have a peak? And, you know, if there's an election or if there's like one ballot that's happening, that's a peak. And then there's a trough where we're building and doing the work. And so we scaffold it, right? And you have to strategically sequence your change making efforts because you can't consistently be at peaks. And then the other thing that I've learned as an organizer was we don't celebrate enough, right? And I'm not talking about a victory party. I'm talking about an appreciation party.
Yes.
You don't celebrate people in the team after a campaign. So when we ran a campaign, when I ran a team, the most important piece is we win or we lose, we have after every campaign a celebration of the people who made it possible. And then I think the final piece I would say is just seeing our place in the ecosystem. I
Mm-hmm.
really you know, to be candid, struggling with that. And it's been a learning journey for me to say, we can't burn all stoves at once. We have to tag team, right? And I think
Yes.
in this climate, it feels like we have to solve everything all at once by ourselves from the device that we're doom scrolling on.
Oh my gosh, that hits home.
We have to get out of the device and meet our neighbor and then think about slowly building the power that we need, because once you build a power that becomes this fuel to combat the burnout that is very natural, very kind of is, you know, kind of a consequence of this relentless work, but the burnout can become into resilience the second you kind of have the people around you to really fuel you back up. And I think that I'll pause there as some of my meditations on how to respond to this moment of this endless work, uphill battle.
I so appreciate like the vulnerability that you're sharing as you share it loud here and talk about some of the burnout that you've seen and experienced as well. I think there's two things I want to touch on before we go to questions. I think first is, and I'm going to try to say this correctly, but forgive me if I'm thinking out loud. I think sometimes when it comes to celebration and joy in this work, some people feel guilt around doing that because the work is never done. The struggle is still there. There are still people who are suffering. And so there's this feeling, I think, that many experience, and I've experienced before too, that like, do we have the right to celebrate? Is it even okay to take a day off from this work? And I actually think it's very important that we counter that narrative with the fact that if we don't have moments and embed moments of happiness and joy, knowing that multiple things are true at once, then like we're actually never going to last. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I think that's, and you know, I think I resonate with that. Oftentimes I think of like the world burning around me and kind of feeling like, wow, I don't deserve this joy or I don't deserve this celebration. Like why I need to just shut it down. And to be very kind of candid in a very big room is, you know, I think about planning a wedding of my own in a world that where the news cycle is one battle after the other across the world. And I remember one of my mentors told me, she's like, you're actually creating pockets of joy for others too. And so it's
Mhm.
not actually just you experiencing this, you know, private joy. It's a very public joy, and that joy actually is filling a lot of people's cups to build that resilience over time, and find a source of hope, because joy will breed more joy will breed more joy, but it will also breed more like muscle for us to
It's so true.
keep the work.
So first of all, congratulations that you're planning your wedding. That's a really wonderful thing. And what I reflect on is that you're right, like it's love actually that we're all working towards, right? So may you give yourself the permission to celebrate and feel that fully in your community. I guess like one last question before we open it up to our audience is I want to ask what's at stake if we don't do this work, right? Because I think that a lot of people are overrun by the complexity of their lives, of work, of a family caregiving, of, sometimes falling into zero-sum game mindsets and scarcity thinking around the fact that I just have to take care of me and mine, and who cares about everybody else? Um, so if we don't make that reach across divides, and look, I don't want to end on a negative note, but I do want to talk about for real, what are the consequences for us and for our communities and democracies if we don't do this, all of us?
Yeah. Talk about the urgency, right, of change. Um, and I think we're kind of living the consequence right now as we speak
Yeah.
across the world in many ways, where we see this kind of constant labeling, boxing of people and dehumanizing of people through those labels, at every level. The biggest consequence, I think, is we lose a sense of belonging,
Mm-hmm.
communities that we're part of. And that means that we are breeding isolation, for our own selves, but also for each other. And that to me is actually so much more dangerous than any, ballot or any kind of, new AI technology that we're seeing in the headlines and we're kind of feeling fear from. But I think that sense of isolation and can lead to this fragmentation, um, in a world where we say that, oh, actually, we forget the idea that when we come together, we can build something bigger than ourselves, and that there can be hope or there can be change. And even if that change is 5%, 10%, we have moved a little bit forward, right? And so I think that sense of belonging for me is really what's at stake here. Um, and that's why we have to get up every day and find the sources of hope that propel us forward, and find the people that will help us do it.
It's interesting that you said the word lonely, and I think you're absolutely right. Everybody gets hurt. But actually, a really great organization in Toronto called the Toronto Foundation actually issued a report called last year called Toronto the Lonely, which really isolated the huge problem of the loneliness epidemic, and that people feel that they don't have neighbors and friends and that they're just kind of isolated online, and what the impacts are across the community. So I really appreciate you double tapping that, and for us to really singularly think about how we interpersonally tackle that challenge going forward. But I do want to leave on a positive note. Can you tell us about something that you're working on, like what comes next, and how can our highly engaged audience get more involved and continue to learn from you after today?
Yeah. Well, what comes next is to be in relationship with each other, with me, through the different ways that are out there. What comes next also is, I continue the work of building leadership, right? It's different than delegating. It's different than empowering. It's actually building leadership capacity so that we're actually, um, building a network of people who can have their own networks and, their own communities. And so I think one big next step would be to kind of think about whose leadership are you building to do this work, and how can you help them connect with the other leaders around them or change makers around them. And leadership, I don't mean in terms of a title. I just mean in terms of folks who are taking the responsibility to help us chart this uncertain world.
That is awesome. Thank you so much. And so we have a number of questions that have come in. So I know we want to do them justice, but maybe we'll try to do like 1 minute answers so we can get to all of them. So first of all, the first question is from Christine Sheldon. Hi, Christine. So the question for Vandinika is, hello all, I'm Christine calling in from the Netherlands. Thank you for these brilliant insights. You mentioned how bridging divides isn't about erasing differences. It's about building long-standing relationships with a focus on values and interests. But inevitably, compromising on those differences means some participants will feel disappointed or that their priorities were left aside. How do you suggest managing these dynamics when building change coalitions? That's a great question.
It's a great question from a really great scholar that I happen to know. Uh, so I think it goes back to a couple of things around how are we positioning ourselves as leaders for them and saying, what is it that we're here to build? As a leader, I'm not here to get you all of the demands. I'm actually here to get you progress. And what does progress look like? And, and what does move forward movement look like? And so kind of being in relationship with your people, you will understand what is on top priority and what is really like the highest stake demand and need. And we need to deliver on that. We need to keep pushing. And what is something that I can wait on and sequence and really think about how am I sequencing my change-making efforts. And I think when the disappointment is real, right?
Yeah.
And it is, the way that I often think about it is that disappointment is good because that means that they have a stake in the work that you're doing, right? It means
you're right. If people are feeling something.
They're feeling something, they are part of the process. And you actually want to then help them convert that disappointment into agency and say, okay, you have a choice here. What do you want to do with this disappointment? Do you want to build the power that you need to increase the leverage and influence that you have? Or do you want to kind of stay in that sort of fearful, resentful headspace or heart space that can actually prevent you from having any other further victory? And so it's a couple of different things, but that's how I would slice it, at least to begin with.
Thank you for that. This next question comes in from an anonymous attendee. It says, thank you, Vandinika. I'm curious how you work to support young leaders working in communities where divisive and toxic politics dominate the discourse.
Yes, I mean, honestly, that's kind of a very big part of the constituency that I work with or get to work with, right? Of folks who are operating in environments that are very hard for them, or that are very divisive, the way they are kind of the person pushing the boulder up the hill, and then there are many, many people pushing it down. How we work with them is to actually help them build a network of similar young people with shared values so that they have an external source of solidarity, hope, and even ideas, right? So they're not doing this alone, even if they are in a particular city, state, as the only person, or in a particular community, they may be the only person in a divisive, toxic kind of environment, but they have their sources or their networks where they can find hope and solidarity. And so that's why it becomes so important for hope to breed hope, and for us to kind of build the networks of leaders that we're building, which we do at the Obama Foundation, of course, and I do in my personal life as well.
So we have two more questions. I'm going to ask you one in the interest of time, but I promise that Vandinika and I will write to the person or write to the whole group with the other question about the one we can't get to, and I'm sorry for that. But there's a really great question here from our very good friend Arman Hamidian. Hey, Arman. He notes that, as you said, relationship building is key to working across differences. But when elected officials do engage in working across divides, it can provoke backlash from their own supporters. How have you advised on navigating that tension, which is really building bridges while remaining accountable to those who elected you? We could do a whole dialogue on that.
That could be a whole separate dialogue. But I think very quickly, I would say, I mean, it all comes down to the type of leader you are, of course, and how you're framing your leadership and practicing your leadership. But I think it also comes down to like delivery. As leaders, our elected officials need to deliver outcomes. And that delivery of outcomes comes through coalitions, and comes because that's how you actually move budgets as well, in governance. And so I think we actually need to kind of reverse the situation where we say, actually, we need to expect our elected officials to deliver. And our expectation and our gets a little bit right-sized that, okay, well, to deliver, they have to make
sacrifices, right?
Sacrifices, or make a coalition that may not make sense right now, or that make trade-offs, so that they can deliver. And then we need to know as an electorate what is important for us, like what deliverables are important to us. And then we can hold our elected officials accountable, right? So I think the accountability is not just in positions or political positions, but I think accountability in their delivery of outcomes can change that relationship that we have with our elected officials, and therefore change the public perception of when there is a leader out there who's trying to do that connecting work.
Thank you for those powerful last words. And with that, we're already out of time, but we're absolutely going to invite Vandinika back Thank you for being so vulnerable, for opening up and telling us all of your narratives, your stories, the things that help you, the things that have, been difficult to work through. And I really appreciate the audience engagement throughout. For our audience, we'll be back in the fall with Democracy Dialogues. In the meantime, we absolutely invite you to look at all of the sessions from the Canadian Vote Summit that are now online that you can take in May. And I just want to say thank you to all of you and wishing you a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you and take care. Bye.